I'd like to welcome our guest speaker, Francis Clooney, who's the Parkman Professor of Divinity and Professor of Comparative Theology at Harvard Divinity School. He holds a doctorate in South Asian languages and civilizations from the University of Chicago and a Master of Divinity from Weston School of Theology. He serves regularly as a Roman Catholic priest and has been a member of the Society of Jesus for 50 years. We invited him to join us here today primarily because he's a leading figure in the developing field of comparative theology, a discipline distinguished by attentiveness to the dynamics of theological learning, deepened through the study of traditions other than one's own. Among his many publications, most have been engaged in furthering the dialogue between Christianity and Hinduism. In particular, as we worked to prepare for this class, Pranav and I were heavily influenced by his marvelous book, Hindu God, Christian God, How Reason Helps Break Down the Boundaries Between Religions. So without any further ado, I'll hand things over to him.
Okay, I hope you can hear me okay. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. I thank you, Stephen. I thank you, Pranav, for the invitation that came, I think, the beginning of the summer in a warmer, brighter time than it is now in Boston, at least. So I'm happy to be here with you today and to share in this class. I look forward to our discussion. As I said before we were all online, it's one thing for me to speak, but I sort of know what I'm going to say, you would hope. But to hear the questions and the fresh perspectives is also exciting. So I look forward to our discussion over the time we have together. So what I thought I would do to maximize my use of my portion of this, which will probably be a half hour, a little bit more, I'm not quite sure, but nonetheless not too long, would be, first of all, to tell you more about myself and how I became the kind of person who does the kind of work that I do across the Hindu-Christian boundary. Then secondly, to give you an example, and at that point I'll put some translations of South Indian Tamil Hindu poetry up on maybe in the chat, or I'll just screen share one or the other, to show you something that I'm working on and the kind of problems that I perceive arising. Then I'll say something about the chapter 1 of my comparative theology book that you, I believe, have read for today, and what I was trying to do in that chapter in light of the kind of work I do and in light of the kind of person I am. And then Pranav and Steve were gracious to send me some of your comments on my chapter. And I'll just take up a couple of points, not very exhaustively, from the comments that were sent to me. And then we can open it up from there. So the first thing would be a little bit more about myself, in addition to what Steve just said, introducing me. So I am Irish Catholic, grew up in New York City, born in Brooklyn, grew up on Staten Island, went to a Catholic Jesuit high school in Manhattan, and then entered the seminary right away. So back then, 1968, it was much more common, it's unheard of now in the Catholic Church for somebody to enter seminary when they're 18 years old. I just turned 18 like 4 days before. And so I was very young. We wouldn't do that now, but nonetheless, we did it then. So I entered the seminary at a young age, did the 2 years of basic training that is called novitiate. One is a novice and one is in the novitiate. Basic training, learning to pray, learning about the history of the Society of Jesus, the religious order to which I belong, which I can tell you more about later if you're interested. Then 3 years of philosophy study. I basically, for somebody like me who was young, a double major, philosophy and classics. So in high school, I'd done a lot of Greek and Latin. I was old days, and majored in classics and majored in philosophy at the same time. And it was strictly the great books of Western medieval philosophy, a few modern books, but basically the classics of the West, from the Greeks to the Middle Ages and so on. Theology study was 3 years up here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I am back now for a number of years. And basically the training in the Roman Catholic Church to become a priest. And so for 3 years, I studied theology, Bible, ethics, Christology, all the doctrines of the church and all that, and was ordained a priest in 1978. So that part of my description of self is fairly straightforward, fairly ordinary. And I think if that was all there was to me, that would be pretty good, but you probably wouldn't have invited me to be here today. Because the other part of what I did was between the period of philosophy study, the 3 years of philosophy, classics, double major, and the theology study, we do 2 years of practical work, either parish work or more commonly teaching in a high school. And I was sort of destined, I think, by background to go back to either Regis High School in Manhattan, where I had studied, or another of the Jesuit high schools in New York City and teach Greek and Latin or literature or something like that. But around 1971, 2 years before I had to do this training, I got a bright idea inspired by several people I talked to and lectures I heard, that I didn't want to stay in New York. I wanted to go somewhere far away. And for 2 years to teach in a different part of the world. I considered options that were presented to me. One was to go to the Philippines, Manila, where the Jesuits had a number of schools and so on connected with New York in those days. The Caroline Islands in the Pacific, Chuuk and Ponape, and over toward Guam. So way out there in the middle of the Pacific would have been another possibility. Somehow I was in connection with a priest in Ecuador, Quito in Ecuador. And this is, of course, not by email or phone, but writing letters laboriously back and forth. And he had a program for slum children and invited me very passionately to come and learn Spanish and work with him in the slums. I didn't do that either. So having considered a few other options, what I found in my heart of hearts, which is still inexplicable all these years later, was that I wanted to go to India. And I had this bright idea that given my classics background, on the one hand, India has a classical language, Sanskrit, and the classical language Sanskrit is related to Greek and Latin. They're all the same family of languages. So I could build on my language learning, but it's also a very different culture, a very ancient culture. It's also in those days, I conceived of it as a very poor country, although now it's one of the world's largest economies. But nonetheless, a really different place with an ancient culture. And importantly for me, although I didn't know what I was talking about, also another religion as well. And that was interesting to me, having grown up almost, if not quite, in a Catholic ghetto, the Catholic part of New York City, Catholic schools, Catholic parish, altar boy, all that kind of thing. And then right into seminary at a young age. I wanted to go somewhere far away. I was impressed by two figures that everybody knew about. On the one hand, Mahatma Gandhi, who was an inspiration then and now for me, and Mother Teresa, leaving her comfortable convent to go and work with the poorest of the poor. So to cut a long story short, I didn't actually go to India, despite having said all of that, because visa problems were really hard in 1972, 73, after the so-called Bangladesh War, when India defended East Pakistan against West Pakistan, and East Pakistan became Bangladesh. So I was told by a wise old priest that came through Fordham where I was, think of going to Kathmandu, Nepal instead. And of course, at that point, I had no idea what Kathmandu was or even where it was, Nepal. But it's a little kingdom up in the Himalayas, tucked between Tibet, China to the north, and India to the south. So it's a tiny country, but now it's about 30 million people. So it's not that tiny. But when you have the two largest countries in the world, India and China, on the two sides of you, you feel very small. And the Jesuits had been invited into Nepal around 1950 by the king of Nepal to set up a good school. The king was getting tired of brain drain and the best young men and women in the country going abroad to study and never coming back. And so he invited the Jesuits from Patna in Bihar in India to come up and set up a school, St. Xavier's School, which was a school that was flourishing. It was considered, I think still is, one of the best schools in the country. And I got there in 1973 to teach in this boarding school. The upper grades were English medium. That was one of the goals, was to have fluency in English. And my job was to teach English language subjects, reading, speech, pronunciation, grammar, some literature. We actually read a play. We read Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. We read an abbreviated form of A Tale of Two Cities by Dickens, some odd things that were just in the curriculum. But the other course that I had to teach was called Moral Science. And moral science was premised on the idea that when the king invited the Jesuits in, the deal was that the Jesuits would not try to convert the students. They could teach them anything, but would not try to convert them to Christianity. And the Jesuits didn't want to teach Hinduism or Buddhism. So moral science was like basic ethical principles, moral codes, sort of the in-between space of learning morality, ethics, why be good, why tell the truth, why not steal, et cetera, et cetera. All of that was to be taught in this course. So I had this book and was asked to teach moral science to like 9th grade and 10th grade. And when I went in the classroom to teach them, again, I was 4 or 5 years older than them maximum. I found it, and they found it to be really boring, that this was incredibly abstract, ethical principles, reasons about morality, and so on like that. And I said, look, I'm a Catholic, and all the boys I taught in all these classes I taught were Hindu and Buddhist. Why not do as I would do if I was teaching in America, use religious texts to communicate ethical issues, moral values, truth claims, and so on. But I didn't want to bring in the Bible. I think that was not going to work. So I started reading Hindu texts and Buddhist texts. The Bhagavad Gita, I'm sure some of you have read the Bhagavad Gita, some of the stories of the Buddha's previous lives, stories about Rama and Sita from the epic Ramayana, and so on. And this was probably one of the best things I did as a teacher, because it brought the classes alive. So instead of being, let's talk about abstractions and morality in general, let's instead actually talk about matters that are religiously pertinent in what then, and I think still now, is a very religious country, Nepal. Altogether 70% Hindu and maybe 30% Buddhist, although Kathmandu and north up into the mountains toward Tibet is largely Buddhist. So if you only went to Kathmandu, the capital, you would think it's a Buddhist country. If you go down toward India, you realize that the majority of the people in the country are Hindu. So I think then I started without any background as a scholar, without any elaborate academic preparation, teaching Hinduism, teaching Hindu texts, teaching about Krishna, teaching about the Buddha and all that with boys, because the girls' school was across the wall and the sisters taught in the girls' school, teaching these boys about sharing with them about their own religion and their own tradition, and talking to them about how being a religious person works out if you are a Hindu or a Buddhist. In the meantime, since I was there in the city, in the school, I began to have opportunities to go outside the school compound, obviously. Kathmandu, even now, but especially back then, was an incredibly beautiful city in a valley almost a mile high, surrounded by hills that go to 10,000 feet. And then off in the distance, I think it's too smoggy now, but back in the 70s, you could see Mount Everest from the roof of the school. So incredibly beautiful place. And scattered throughout the Kathmandu Valley were a number of very old temples, Hindu temples, Buddhist stupas or shrines. And I remember one of the most vivid early experiences I had was going just south of the valley, out of the valley, a little bit south, to a place called Dakshin Kali, which literally means the southern Kali, or the southern temple for the goddess Kali. And I was fascinated, I think, to go there because intuitively, at some instinctual level, that was actually what I was looking for, because it was an exotic old temple in the mists outside the valley. And it was a goddess temple where, therefore, there were animal sacrifices twice a week. So I went with some workers from the school. We went to this temple, and on a Tuesday, watched animals like goats and chickens being slaughtered and offered to the goddess. And then most of the animal given back to the family or person who offers it to go and either bring home and eat it at home or go over and cook it on the side or something like that. But it was so exotic for me to visit a goddess temple and to see animal sacrifice. And I realized this was something completely outside my experience. I don't know what you think of Roman Catholics, but we don't do animal sacrifices. We basically behave ourselves in church. And this was really different from anything I had grown up with. And what I think it was a pivotal point, because on the one side, I could have been repulsed by it. and said, this is really pagan, this is idolatrous, this is awful. Or, as actually happened, I was totally enchanted by it and said, there's something holy, something sacred here, something I don't understand that I feel myself being attracted to. Now, I know one of the questions that'll come up later is about relativism and how can you hold two things to be true at the same time, or what's the problem with just saying all these things are true. But I think for me, it was sort of, being a Roman Catholic who took religion seriously, church seriously, the Catholic Mass and so on seriously. I was seriously seeing the rituals of another religious tradition. And the opportunity was, can you take this seriously? And I found in my heart of hearts, I said, I will take it seriously. And I think that the issue, and this is related to my general theme, was about how you end up being a comparative theologian and learning interreligiously without being a pluralist, is that I was in a situation where I was in seminary. I was going to be ordained a priest a few years later. I didn't want to give up on being Roman Catholic. I wasn't planning to become a Hindu. I wasn't going to be an agnostic. I wasn't going to give up my faith altogether and just say, I don't believe any of this anymore. But I wanted to take the others seriously to heart. And I found what I was doing was sort of, as I had crossed from New York to Kathmandu, what in those days was a very long trip with like 6 or 7 stops along the way because the planes had to refuel, all the way to Kathmandu from New York, all the way from Catholic identity into a Hindu practicing identity. And I could multiply examples, Buddhist shrines in the Kathmandu Valley, Vishnu temples, Shiva temples, other beautiful places. And then over the past 50 years, other Hindu temples in Calcutta, in Gujarat, in Rajasthan, and particularly in the south of India, Madras or Chennai, and point south all the way down to the tip of India. Again, finding myself again and again attracted by holy places and attracted by temples I went to. And I think what I was finding is that a model in which all of these things would be explained in terms of some kind of rational model for the sacred, or some rational model for how people ritualize, wasn't going to work for me, because I didn't want somebody explaining away my tradition as a Catholic by rationalizing it as an example of some kind of human instinct toward the divine or something like that. No, I was Catholic. And I, was the church that traced back to the apostles and so on like that. And I felt that to be decent and honest, I had to take the Hinduism I was learning and the Buddhism seriously as also having ancient roots that I was not in a position to dismiss or explain away as merely historical or explain away by anthropological methods. And therefore, I wanted to have this kind of ongoing encounter where my tradition and other traditions really learned from one another. So I was in an existential situation that I think continues to now. In a few minutes, I'll explain how this relates to the chapter of my book that you have, is where my model was not going to be a higher understanding, a viewpoint from which to explain and understand other people's religions intellectually or philosophically, nor was I going to say that mine alone was true and theirs were false, because I didn't want to say that, but rather some kind of a pilgrimage process, if you can use that term. I don't think it's in my chapter, but you sort of, you go as a pilgrim, you go from your place to a holy place. You are there, you experience the holy. Let's say if somebody like me from New York goes, or you, most of you on the screen, go to Jerusalem and you visit holy sites in Jerusalem, or you go for you go to India and you visit holy sites, or other parts of the world, you go for holy sites, that this crossing over is always presumed to be related to some kind of coming back. So you go over, you visit, you enter into sacred spaces, you hear sacred words, you see sacred images, you go, you circumambulate temples, you climb holy mountains, and then you come back. And as with me, when I came back to New York in 1975, before coming up to Cambridge to study theology, I was and was not the same person who had gone several years before. So I didn't, distress my parents by saying, now I'm a Hindu. They would have been heartbroken. And I didn't say, let me entertain you with stories of the ridiculous Indians and the stupid things they believe, but rather that I had had these kind of crossover experiences that I wanted to preserve. And I think for me, through the years, even now, there is a sense of crossing over, appreciating the sacredness, the goodness of the other, and then coming back and being Roman Catholic. And I could go on for hours about this. I won't, I promise. About the Catholic Church's teachings in the past 60 years, about believing, as the Vatican Council II, 1962 to 65 said, whatever is true and holy in other religions, we welcome and we respect. And while that is a fairly minimal statement, whatever is true and holy, we welcome and respect, could mean a lot or a little. Nonetheless, it was like a license or permission for me to welcome and understand and appreciate what I found to be true and holy in the traditions I met in the East. And I think that's what I've tried to do both in my research, in my writing, in my teaching over the years, is to cross over and cross back without ruining what I experienced in crossing over. And I'm not sure this is going to make sense, but what I'd like to do now is share with you some poetry that I'm translating, some Hindu poetry from the Tamil language in South India. What I'm trying to read it and understand it and make sense of it in English without explaining it away. And I think, I'm sure all of you are, have taken literature classes, have studied poetry, maybe you are poets. The ways in which poetry is very stubborn because it doesn't want to be explained away. One thing a poet hates, as I've learned over the years, is when somebody says, could you just tell me what your poem is about? Your poem doesn't have a title, so please tell me what it's about. And the poet will simply, again, read the poem to you again and read it a third time if necessary, because the poetry speaks for itself. And the question is, of course, a larger question, which I can't go into. Does poetry speak for itself when you translate it? Those of us who grow up, let's say Christian, which maybe is most of us on the screen, I'm guessing, or a Christian context at least, we believe that the word of God speaks in translation. Most Christians, I think, do not actually read the Hebrew and the Greek of the Bible, but we believe that it speaks to us in our own language, be it English or French or Chinese or Vietnamese, or one of the Wolof, or a language of West Africa, and so on like that. All these languages work. Does the poetry of another religious tradition speak to us? So I'm translating this poetry. I'm translating like 4 South Indian Hindu saints from the 6th or 7th through 10th centuries, South India, who together among the 4 of them, and they're sort of legendary figures, wrote about 550 verses. And there have been translations, most of which I think personally are not very good, of this poetry in the past. And I'm working on a new translation, which I might be finished with a year from now. But I thought to show you some verses and give you a feel for the stubborn concreteness and reality of the Hindu traditions that I study, that it's sort of in a textual way, something like a goddess temple, which doesn't go away if you explain it away. It's still there when you've explained it. And this poetry, I think, speaks for itself, but there are all kinds of innumerable questions that arise around the edges of the poetry. So let me show it to you. The last thing I'd say before showing it to you is, what was I going to show you? So today is November 28th. I figured that out for myself. November 28th. And I figured of these 5 works of the South Indian saints that I'm translating, I would take the 28th verse of each work and put it up on the screen. So I didn't pick these 5 because they were all the same or all different, but 28 verses for the 28th day of the month. So let me see if I can find this and show it to you.
Professor Clooney, did you want us to share the Word file you gave us in chat, or are you going to do it yourself?
What do you think? Should I do it screen share or put it in chat?
I think you could do both.
Yeah, I would do both.
Okay, I can put it, I think I can most easily, I came up with a simpler version of it. So I'll put it in chat in 2 batches. All right, so that's the first 3. I think you can all see that there.
Mm-hmm.
And let me give the other 2. And then there'll be a biblical text later I'll share with you. I found if I tried to do them all in one, it was apparently too big for chat, so I couldn't do them all in one. So everybody should see 5 verses. Poigai Alvar 28, But Alvar 28, Pe Alvar 28, Tirumarisai Piran, first song 28, Tirumarisai Piran, second song 28. I think you all have that there in the margins. Okay, so maybe I'll just work with that for the moment instead of putting it up on the screen share.
If you put it on the screen, then it'll also be on the video, which would be nice.
Oh, okay, all right, let me do that. Okay, so it's the same thing in theory, in the chat and on the screen. And so the first 3, Poigai Alvar, But Alvar, Pe Alvar, are 3 saints who, by legend, had a mystical experience together at the same time during a storm on a stormy night. And the 3 of them all uttered and sang 100 verses each, just came bursting out of them in one mystical moment. And these are the 28th verse of each of their texts. And as I read it to you, I won't explain anything as I read it, but be noticing all the things that you may be not clear about. Unless this course explained everything to you about everything, you probably don't know some of the details here. O dark one, in your hand is the right curling conch and discus. The flower lady rests on your chest. The Lord of the fine secret text rises from your navel. The Lord destroyer of the 3 cities, too, rest on your chest. But Alvar, he is within the mind. His is Mount Venkatam's temple. His the great sea and all else. He is the one in dark Rangam's temple, so hard to comprehend. He is the God of all gods, however many there are. That's how he is explained. But once, too, he was the boy who split the great demon's mouth. And Pe Alvar, he inclines on the snake bed, but for the sake of the 5 brothers, he prompted the fierce war. Yet he bent low before the churn of the cowherd woman, the Lord who drank the breast milk of that demoness with sharp fangs. Tirumarisai Piran, here, the causeway built to destroy the strength of Lanka. Here, the destruction of the monkey Valin. Here, the archer who bent his bow and destroyed Lanka itself, just as he pierced King Ravana's cool garlanded flesh. All this was his play. And finally, you made the earth, dug it, measured it, ate it. You measured the salt sea and crossed it, but even before that, you lay upon it, and then you churned it, held it. You hurl the weapon, pushing the angry Mali and the dear Mali too, right down into bright death's dominion. Your broad hands hold so many weapons. How amazing you are. Now, mindful of limits of time, I'd like to say something briefly about these verses. But the main thing to say first is that they're very hard to explain or explain away by standard theories of religious pluralism. One can be an exclusivist and say, I hate this poetry. None of it is true. I reject it all. But when you say about a poem that it's not true, what exactly are you saying? If you have a proposition, you can say something like that. But if it's poetry, the truth of it, I think, is in the words and in the beauty of the words, not in some kind of theory about it. If you're a pluralist and say, well, all poetry is like all other poetry, and so none of it is true or false, I think you can probably get away with that. But what it does is deflate the truth of the poetry on the screen before you. Some kind of claims being made by these mystical, passionate poets by which they say something to you that they want to captivate you and grip you. And if you say, oh, it's all true, other poetry is true, it's all true, could mean that you don't think any poetry is true, and you lose it. And if you're an inclusivist in a traditional sense, which is sort of the middle position, which is usually the Roman Catholic position, you say, well, this is true, but in some way it's less true than the poetry of the Catholic tradition. Or this is true, but it would be more true if it mentioned Jesus Christ, which I think is a very poor way of reading poetry. Briefly about each one, Poigai Alvar's verse, signs of iconic power as you'd see in the temple. a conch that is blown in to begin a battle, the war discus that is thrown in battle, the flower lady, Sri Lakshmi, the goddess, resting on the chest of the god, the Lord of the fine secret text rising from your navel, the creator god, Brahma, the Lord destroyer of the three cities, Shiva, also resting on your chest, basically saying this dark one who has the conch and the discus is with the goddess and is greater than the gods Brahma and Shiva. But it's showing it by these picture images. The second verse, he is in the mind. His is Mount Venkatam, Tirupati temple, one of the great temples of India. His is the ocean, the sea, and all else. He lives in this other temple, Sri Rangam, so hard to understand. He is the God of all gods, however many there are. And this is in quotes. It's a quote. This is kind of a confessional statement about the greatness of the god Vishnu Narayana, although his name is not given. That's how he is explained. But once too, he was a child, a boy, who split the great demon's mouth. And what it seems to be saying is that you have these great images of Vishnu Narayana, who is this great Lord of everything. But don't forget the stories of the baby Krishna, the boy Krishna, who in his play and his enjoyment from day to day was also beset by demons. And as a little boy, he had phenomenal strength, and the demon came to eat him, the horse demon, and he just rips open its mouth and kills it. And it seems to be a contrast between the transcendent and the simple. Payalvar, he reclines on the snake bed. He rests on the ocean, as in the first verse. For the sake of the five brothers, this is in the great war, the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, he prompted a fierce war. Yet he bent low before the churn of the cowherd woman. Boy Krishna, baby Krishna, acted like a mischievous 2-year-old. He'd go around like trying to get at the butter his mother had churned, putting his hand in and taking glops of butter to put into his mouth. And so she tied him to the churn, to the big stone, so that he couldn't run around and do mischief. And he let himself be bent low and tied to the churn. And yet that same child, as a baby, a demoness with sharp fangs came with poisoned breast milk to kill him. And he knew who she was, and so he drank her milk and sucked all the life out of her. And again, it's this great Lord of the universe prompting the battle of the Bhagavad Gita, tied to a churn because he's a naughty little boy, and as a baby, kills a demon by sucking out her breast milk. The contrast, I think, is the key issue. And this next verse refers to the Ramayana, a story you may not be familiar with, or some of you are. The great story of Rama, the prince who leaves his city. He's exiled into the forest with his spouse Sita, his brother Lakshmana. And for complicated reasons, his wife Sita is kidnapped and taken over to Sri Lanka. And he has to create a war, an army to go there. So he builds a causeway in order to cross over and destroy Sri Lanka. He kills along the way, a complicated story, the monkey Vali, favoring his brother Sugriva, because he's trying to make sense of who the people in the forest are, and he kills one and saves the other. With an arrow, he destroys Lanka. He just one of his flaming arrows like a great bomb, and he destroys and pierces King Ravana, the evil king who had kidnapped his wife. And then a comment, all these heroic deeds, all of this was his play. The Sanskrit word not used here, but similar, is lila, L-I-L-A. It's all his play. He did it without any effort at all. So all the great deeds of the Lord, realize that it's all simply the play of the Lord who could do this forever. And then the last one, from the fifth work, there are two works by one author. You made the earth, you dug it, you measured it, you ate it, you emitted it again. These are stories of what God has done, creating the earth, digging his tusks into it when he came, O-A-R, in order to save it from drowning. Steps, he crossed the entire universe. At the end of the age and the new age, he puts it out again and creates the world again. He crossed the salt sea, but even before that, he lay upon it and rested on it, as in the third verse and the first verse, resting on the ocean, kind of the primal sense of God between heaven and earth. He destroys these demons, Mali and the deer Mali, and sends them down into hell. how amazing you are with so many weapons. Now, I think I've said enough about these verses to abbreviate. And again, you can be looking at them in the chat, and then we can talk about them. My point is, I'm assuming that for many of you, this is the first time you've heard these references, the first time you've heard of these poets. But I see one of my jobs in life, as one would do if they were a conservationist or an environmentalist, preserving temple sites in North India or the Himalayas, preserving ancient temples and not letting them be knocked down and turned into parking lots, preserving the poetry of different religious cultures without saying, oh, they're just saying the same thing we're saying, or their poetry is just human poetry, whereas our poetry in the Bible is sacred poetry, or without saying, I'm not interested in poetry at all, so I just rather talk about propositions and truth claims. So can you put the poetry aside and let's talk about truth, or talk about what is good or not? And I think the poetry is elusive, because is it true or not? Well, who's to say? Depends in part on the saints who proclaim it and sang it, because it's songs, claiming it, proclaiming it, making sense of it. That's part of what's going on. And part of it is referring to great events from the tradition that are taken to be true. And these events taken to be true are very, very deep in the tradition. And all traditions have these. So if we, any of us who are of the biblical tradition, Jewish or Christian, can talk casually about God creating the world in 7 days, or the flood when Noah was instructed to build the ark, or Moses leading the people out of Egypt, going to Sinai and the 10 Commandments are given, crossing the desert, coming to the promised land, King David building, basically making his kingdom the city of Jerusalem, Solomon, his son, building the great temple in Jerusalem, and so on. These things don't have to be explained to people who know the Bible. But if you don't know the Bible, they don't make any sense. You don't know these stories, and therefore they don't make sense. Jesus, who changed water into wine. Jesus, who walked on the water. Jesus, who prayed in the garden before his death. Jesus, who rose on the third day. If you're in the Christian tradition, you know these stories. And it's hard to explain to people, I know that they're true for the following propositional reasons, or I know by the following logic that they're true. No, they're just true because I live them, I grew up with them, they're part of my life, they're part of my prayer, my worship. And I think my sense is, and this is something we could disagree about, is that the poetry that I've just shown you as mere examples, the 28th verse of 5 works, is in that sense true, that we are not in a position to dismiss it or explain it away or turn it into logic, but that if we take it positively, it begins to invite us in. So let me tell you about Krishna. Let me tell you about the Lord who slept on the ocean. Let me tell you about him who shot his arrow and killed Ravana. And so on and so on. These stories begin to come alive for you. And I think what the poets are trying to do in their poetry is tell you enough of these stories that you begin to be drawn into them. And you begin to allow them to be part of your life, as somebody would do, possibly, reading Shakespeare, reading in the old days, at least when I was young, reading Greek plays, reading Homer, reading Virgil, or reading Emily Dickinson, or reading a 20th century poet. If you read these things enough, the poetry becomes part of you. And I believe that interreligious learning is learning patiently over time so that these things begin to be part of you. And I think what I found, and this I'll turn now to the chapter, and I'll be done soon, don't worry, would be to say that reading this poetry and learning from it, like going to the Kali temple outside the valley where the animal sacrifice was going on, did not ruin my Catholic faith. It did not destroy my faith. It did not take away my faith. I could have, but I didn't become a Hindu. But I didn't become a rationalist who said, well, all of these things are just examples of the following theory. I didn't do that either. And I didn't, in a kind of a ranking way of saying, well, these things are true. This poetry is true. That temple is very nice. But the things of my religion are more true. Because I think it's odd to say this, like with poetry. Poems by Emily Dickinson are more true than poems by Sappho, or poems by Emily Dickinson are more true than Shakespeare's sonnets. You can say you have a taste or a preference, but it's not the same thing as saying truth, because truth comes in different forms. And I think, you can ask me, did these things happen? Did he really kill the demoness by sucking out the poison from her breast? Did he measure the universe in 3 steps? You can ask, to some extent, questions like that about the Bible. Did God really create the world in 7 days? Did Cain really kill Abel? Did Moses actually get 2 tablets of stone up on the mountain? And my point is not to ask those questions cynically and say, well, of course, these things are not true, but they're generally speaking not historically provable, because we don't actually have the documentary evidence we need. But truth comes in different forms, and truth comes in ways that I think speaks to us, even if it doesn't fit scientific criteria or historical evidence criteria. So with that in mind, I will turn briefly to the chapter, and then say something a little bit about some of the questions that I think I've been anticipating from what some of the comments I received in advance. So in the chapter of my book, Comparative Theology, Deep Learning Across Religious Borders, I had been invited by this publisher, Blackwell's, to write this book. So it's always a nice thing. This will happen to you too at some point. Maybe somebody will ask you to write something, and that'll be quite fun. But to write a book explaining what I call the field comparative theology. And the chapter that you have, which is only one of 9 chapters, you got to read the whole book, because I give examples like in chapters 6, 7, and 8 of how I actually do comparative study. Some chapters are historical, but those chapters are examples of how I do it. And chapter 9 is kind of open-ended. Where are things going from here? Looking at it in 2010. What I was trying to do in the first chapter is explain what the difference is between history of religions, comparative religion, and comparative theology. That was one thing. And then secondly, how comparative theology is not the same as missiology or theology of religions. And what I found when I finished my graduate program in 1984 at the University of Chicago. I got a job teaching at Boston College, the Catholic Jesuit University here in Boston, about 4 miles from here. When I got there, some of the older faculty were of the view that since I was studying a non-Christian tradition, namely Hinduism, I could not be a theologian. Therefore, I was a world religions person. I was a comparative religion person. I actually belonged over at Harvard. They didn't know they were being prophetic, that I would go to Harvard eventually. But they were saying you can't be a theologian because theologians deal with the truth of the Catholic tradition, the Bible, and the tradition from Peter the Apostle up to the Pope. And if you're not doing that, then you're not a theologian. You're a comparative religion person. And comparative religion and comparative history of religions are wonderful fields. Looking across documentary evidence, across traditions, studying history, seeing patterns in different religion, creation in multiple religions, sacred trees in different religions, savior figures in different traditions. All these things can be done, and they're quite interesting and quite often can be quite illuminating. But what I was insisting, because I was a stubborn person, still am all these years later, is that you don't get to tell me whether I'm a theologian or not. I don't mean you on the screen here. I meant those old professors at Boston College. Because they're saying faith-seeking understanding, as I say in the chapter, is at the heart of theology. You have faith, you live by some kind of faith tradition, but you still are seeking and having questions. It's not, I have faith and I have no questions, or I have questions and I have no faith, but I have faith and I have questions, and I'm seeking to understand. And that idea of inquiring into the faith, studying the faith, raising questions about the faith and the age in which ones live, that's what theology is as an intellectual discipline. And I said the difference between you and me, I told them, was that you have faith-seeking understanding, reading the Bible, reading St. Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, other great thinkers of Christian tradition, my faith-seeking understanding is learning from Hinduism also, because I knew a lot about the Christian tradition being a Christian. But nonetheless, learning across the boundaries and saying, my faith, my Catholic faith, is learning by learning from the religious other and crossing back and forth. And really, that's a lot of what the chapter is about, is to say, in a non-reductive way, the work I do, I don't see it as merely history or merely comparative philosophy or merely comparative religion, but an act of faith seeking to understand, just doing it interreligiously. I mean, earlier I used the term like pilgrim, that you intellectually, you are a pilgrim, you cross over to another tradition, 1,000 million questions are raised for you, as in the poetry I just showed you, and you come back trying to understand it and how does this possibly fit together with the tradition I belong to? I think if I was writing the chapter now, I would have maybe a stronger footnote there. I do say it like in the 9th chapter of the book. It's easier for people like me to say what I'm saying about belonging to a tradition, studying the other, and coming back, because I actually grew up Roman Catholic, Irish Catholic, altar boy, learned Latin, all this Catholic stuff, very clearly Catholic and not anything else. I realize that perhaps some of you, even on the screen, from different backgrounds and different perspectives, didn't grow up with a single tradition you belong to. And I would say therefore there's a difference. You know, going from Catholic to Hindu works pretty well if you are a Catholic. If you have a very complicated background or are spiritual but not religious or agnostic, that's a different dynamic. But I do think everybody comes from somewhere. And if you have some sense of the meaning of life or the purpose of life or want to find it, then you operate with some kind of existential faith-seeking understanding, even if it's not as simple as Catholic Hindu, Catholic Buddhist, Muslim Buddhist, and so on like that. The other thing I was trying to show in the chapter, and then I'm almost done, would be to say that there are fields in Catholic theology, at least, called missiology and theology of religions. And missiology is really the theology of mission, about why we go around the world preaching the gospel to all nations. And questions arise about, are we doing this so as to save those people? Are we doing it because if they're not baptized, they won't be saved? Do we believe that Christ needs to be brought to India, brought to China, brought to other parts of the world in ancient times? Why preach the gospel and go around the world? Nowadays, of course, priests come from India, from Vietnam, from Africa to populate parishes in North America where there aren't enough priests, and they may feel they're preaching the gospel to the North Americans. So things are changing over time. But that wasn't my field, raising those questions. And it can sound, some people say, those are the questions you have to answer. You know, are people in other traditions saved by their own religions? Do they need to receive Christ in some explicit sense? And I say, sure, you can do that. And I wish you well. But what I'm doing is reading Sanskrit texts, reading Tamil texts, reading poetry, going to temples, and raising a different kind of existential question. The other field is theology of religions, which I think maybe you'd be familiar with by this point, which has, you know, the past 40 years, these standard positions: exclusivism, only my tradition is true, or our tradition; pluralism, all the traditions are true in some way or another, and it's not possible to say one is more true than the others; and inclusivism, which is a tradition that says Christ is the savior, Christ is the universal figure, but God is working mysteriously in the other religions too. So sort of a both-and tradition. I think the second one, the inclusivism, is probably closer to what I believe because I'm a Christian, but not as an ism, like a theory, but rather saying, I will include in my faith what I learned from other religious traditions. I will make it part of my faith. I will bring it in. So just as when I go to India, and you can barely see on the bookshelf next to me, images that I brought back from India with me. If you ever come to Boston, I can give you a tour of my office. But images of Hindu deities, Buddhist stupas, and so on like that, I include them in my office. They become part of my visual experience every day. And it doesn't mean I have a theory about saying all these statues are the same thing, basically, don't worry about it. Or I don't put the true ones on higher shelves and the untrue ones on lower shelves. They're just there. And I think in some ways, intellectually, it's like opening up an imaginative space where these things fit together. So I'm rather than inclusivist, which is Christ, but universal Christ, I'm really an including person who brings the other into my tradition and into engagement with it. So that's sort of at the core of the chapter. The last thing I want to do is just raise several points from the comments that Stephen and Pranav sent to me, and then I will stop. So let me see if I won't put them up on this. Should I put them up on the screen? It doesn't matter.
Go ahead.
Okay, all right, I think I have them here. Let me do that. I won't put them in the chat though. I'll leave that out. Sorry, I have to open them up. Hang on a second. Almost there. Okay, so here they're unsigned, so they're anonymous, so I don't know who wrote them. The first one I would just say is a very good summary. I think making clear what I'm trying to talk about and how comparative theology is neither buckling down nor drifting into relativism. So thank you for that one. In the second one, I found, first of all, the person said, I found it persuasive. I like the in-depth look. So this is a very smart student, obviously, who appreciates my work. But toward the bottom, what I do question, though, is just how these religions are leading to a deeper understanding of personal religion. It is not defined, likely because it was an introductory chapter, and it's true, I do go into some of this later, but I'd be interested in diving deeper into these concepts, how my research in different areas of Hinduism led me further in the search for the true and the good. And I think, I mean, words like deeper are humanistic words I see. It's not quantitative. But I think in many ways over the years, reading Hindu poetry, going to Hindu temples, seeing Hindu goddesses have changed the way and deepened the way I think about Catholic things. So I wrote a book once called Hindu Goddesses and the Virgin Mary. And I think I understand Mary and Catholic tradition better and more deeply, I think, because of understanding something about Hindu goddesses. Or reading the poetry that I put up on the screen, I think has given me deeper insight about how to read the Psalms, the 150 Psalms in the Bible, and to understand them a different better. So the search for the true and the good, where does the true end? Where does the good end? And one can talk about this again in kind of a theoretical space. You know, what is truth? What are the limits on truth? What is the theory of truth? Or one can say, as I say, I happen to be reading South Indian Tamil poetry from the 6th to the 9th century. And I'm happy to be translating it. I happen to put up on the screen the 28th verse of each of these works. And I find so much in it that is true and good. And I'm very disinclined to say it's not good or it's not true. And that opens up for me a possibility of learning from it without having to feel myself to be in a position of passing judgment. I'll just keep going. Here, I think, I forget if I put this in italics or if it was in italics. As believers, we must be able to defend the relevance of the faith of our community, deepening our commitments alongside, I think that's probably me, sorry. Okay, that's me who was put in the thing. Why must relativism be avoided? And what exactly does relativism mean here, if not the acknowledgement that one's faith is not the best out of all others? I think there's a certain element of that, like a certain humility. I wouldn't call it relativism, but I don't need to go around, even if I'm the staunchest of Christians, saying that I just like to, welcome you all, and I'm so glad you're here. I just want to start by saying my religion is better than yours. I don't think that is a necessarily confessional Christian view to put forward. I think one can speak very deeply and personally about who Jesus Christ is if you're a Christian, and why Jesus is your Savior, why Jesus is the Savior. But I don't think that translates into saying, therefore, the Christian religion as I know it is better than your Hindu religion or your Buddhist religion. I think there are different levels that one can deal with. The problem with relativism, and I'm speaking from a Catholic context, is that the judgment often is passed by conservative Catholics that when you study other religions, if you don't find out what's wrong with them, you are a relativist. and you don't believe anymore in the truth of the Catholic faith. So I try to avoid terms like relativism. If I had to use a term, I'd do something like relatedness. These traditions are related to one another. But relativism as an ism tends to be able to say, it's all relative, it's true if it's true for you, that's true if it's true for them, and so on like that. And therefore, it's not, I think, a helpful term to use, at least in the Catholic context, but we can talk more about that. Relativist generalizations would be all religions lead to the same absolute. All religions are good. All religions esteem nature. I would say, why do we need those generalizations? Why don't you read some poetry, or why don't you go to a temple, or why don't you read philosophy, and then see what seems to be true and good and real in what you're reading? Next one, I'm almost done. I had never really thought about how religious diversity might be troubling to those already committed to a religious practice. I suppose since I don't have any particular practice, the idea of studying deeply multiple religions only seemed like it could be true to me. And I won't go into deeper, it's a very thoughtful reflection, but to say it does depend on who you are and where you're coming from. So this person saying, I don't have any particular practice, but I certainly do. So I'm a practicing Roman Catholic priest. I said the 7:30 Mass in the parish yesterday, I have the 11 o'clock Mass next Sunday. I live in a religious house with other priests. All of this, I think, can be troubling. It certainly can be challenging. And I know so many priests who are troubled enough by religious diversity that their solution is to never think about it. They just like shut their ears and close it out. I don't want to think about that at all. I just want to talk about the Catholic faith. Because I think people often get bewildered and say, if I take it seriously and I say there is truth in it, how do I know if my own is true? How do I know that maybe none of it is true? But I think their problem often comes around from knowing a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing, and not by going deep, and by not going deeper. So if they would all buy my books and read the poetry I'm translating, then they would be better off because their intellectual depth of understanding would grow and change. But it certainly can be troubling. And I think not just Christians and Jews, but Muslims and people of the Asian traditions, if mine is true, yours is less true, or yours is not true. And then I think I'm at the end here. Yes, rather long, but I'll just touch on it. Given that Clooney believes that comparative theology requires willingness to study other traditions deeply alongside one's own, does that mean that truth claims and other superficial claims within religions are a negligible part of spiritual living? So this is a really good question and a really hard question, because I do get accused sometimes of always putting off truth claims and say, we'll get to that later. Like 10 years after I'm in the grave, we'll get to that one. I'll come back and visit you. I'll haunt you about it. I think I like to say, you have a short life, you can't do everything. And what I'm doing is opening the doors for this learning across religious boundaries, taking things seriously in what they seem to tell us, and argue that I can do this because, as Vatican II said, Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. It doesn't say because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, therefore other religions are false, but rather because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, then whatever is true, whatever is alive, whatever is on the way to God, can also be honored by the Catholic Church. And if I have a sense Jesus is the truth, the way, the life, then it enables me to take truth seriously wherever it is, life, vitality seriously wherever it is, and the way seriously wherever it goes. So I think what I'm trying to do, on the one hand, say certain kinds of questions I don't deal with. I'm not in theology of religions. But secondly, when I'm talking about the truth of poetry or the truth of encounter in a temple, this is not to say truth doesn't matter, but a certain kind of philosophical analytic truth claiming is probably not what I'm doing. And I think I tend to leave that kind of thing out. And how one can do this without losing their own religious affinity or not learning anything new at all, I think it's a real question, a tricky thing. And at any point in our lives, we can go from having a strong sense of truth and looking for truth, faith-seeking understanding, to, oh, whatever, it's all true, oh, whatever, none of it's true. and one can end up losing the sharp edge of one's faith without even realizing it. So I'll stop there. I've gone longer, as I always do, than I thought I would go, but I will stop there, and we can devote the rest of our time to comments, questions, and so on. But thank you for listening.
Thank you. That was fantastic. So officially we have 20 minutes, although I know Pranav and I are willing to stick around for as long as things seem productive. So if you have a hand, I think you should be able to stick your hands up in the Zoom ways, and I can call on you and kind of manage the queue a little bit. So we'll do at least 20 minutes of Q&A, and then I'm sure Pranav and I will at least stick around a little later and ask a few more things, because I have one burning question. So if nobody else chimes in here, I can get us started. I don't see any hands yet, so I'll jump in and then you guys can think about this. So I hope that as a good Catholic boy, you've read your Tolkien. And I am a big Silmarillion fan. And as you might know, there's a really beautiful creation account at the beginning of the Silmarillion that you know, we know when it was written. We know who wrote it. We know that he was just an ordinary human guy. And I like your emphasis on poetry, right? Like if you asked me if that chapter was a true account of the creation of reality, it would be a difficult question to answer. It does seem to be true in a sense, even though I know that it's fictitious in a sense. And so I guess one of the pointed question I want to ask you is there a difference between approaching these texts that you're translating, these poetries that you're translating that are in a religious tradition, versus texts like the Silmarillion that are normally thought of as fictitious? Does it matter whether it's a fiction or not? Is there a difference between approaching something as a religious text versus approaching it as a fictitious one? That's, I think, the question I want to ask.
Yeah, thank you. So Silmarillion, it's been a long time since I've read that one. I'm more familiar with The Lord of the Rings, but I did read it, I think, 30 years ago or more. I thought you might also mention C.S. Lewis. One of the of his chronicles, Aslan, the lion sings the world into existence, I think, which is quite beautiful too. I think, I mean, we talk about this kind of thing at Harvard Divinity School, where we have some faculty I tend to disagree with say that, you know, literature and poetry are the new theology, and that what used to be theology can now be gotten at by reading contemporary novels, contemporary poets, and so on like that. I don't think I want to go that far. Again, I think there has to be a way to preserve a sense of the canon of the Bible, the claims about inspiration and revelation of the sacred text as lived out in the life of the church and so on. And by analogy, these very ancient traditions that have come down for thousands of years in India, the Quran for people of Islam, the Buddhist suttas and stories of the Buddha and so on like that, that these have not simply the test of time, but that they have been life-giving sources for people again and again and again over time. And that if I'm committed to, and every Sunday we'll preach on the readings of the day from the Bible, there's a certain sense in which that kind of commitment makes me leery to say that even Tolkien or C.S. Lewis or a very powerful film that might have been made is the same kind of sacred reality or sacred speech. I think I lost Steve. He seems to have wandered off. But I would say that it's again, slippery slope, that reading sacred text is like reading poetry. Reading sacred accounts of creation is like reading what Tolkien said about creation or his version of creation. But I think there's a way in which one has to be able to distinguish between contemporary accounts that would be imaginative, but are also often indebted, as with Tolkien, to knowledge of the biblical accounts, from saying whatever somebody composes is now equal status with the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, and so on like that. I don't know, Steve, it's a difficult question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And my laptop was just about to say that the battery was going to die because something was wrong with the wiring. I had to run around the back, but it's all working now.
Okay.
I was listening while I was panicking.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I certainly agree that there's a reverence to texts that have been seen and used as sacred for as long as the ones as we're talking about, right? I guess. So I mean, I also come from a Christian background and consider myself to be a Christian in some sense that I don't understand at this point. But so when you say, read the poetry of Hinduism and live in conversation with it, I know I can do that at least in the same way that I do with the Silmarillion, right? Like, I can read it, I can take it seriously, I can even seek the true and the beautiful in it. And I can kind of bracket this question of whether I think it's true in the same kinds of ways as the biblical texts are true. And I guess the puzzlement is, does it make sense to bracket those questions? Does it make sense to, like Hinduism does seem to say, at least sometimes, that, Krishna really did have that conversation with Arjuna in the real world, in a way that, Tolkien would never try to say that the Valar actually had those conversations with, Sauron or whatever, right? Like, and I mean, I guess I'm just asking you to answer the question that you don't want to answer until 10 years after you're dead, right? Like, I understand that minimally you could use all of these texts as poetry, in the sense of, like, it doesn't matter if they're fictitious or not. They're beautiful stories that contain true meanings and good things that I can apply to my life. And I want to just say, well, okay, but I can also say that about the Silmarillion. And like, it does seem like Hinduism won't let itself, to some extent, be treated as equivalent to the Silmarillion, right? Like, no, we're saying more than that. We're saying that it's more truth focused than that is, or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I would just build on that, and I hope others do ask questions, would be to say, all of these things are kind of slippery comparisons or slippery analogies. And on the one hand, so is reading Tamil poetry that has been claimed to be revelatory over the past 1,000 years and is chanted in temples, and the feast of the saint are chanted and celebrated and so on like that. Is that more like the Psalms in the Bible than reading Tolkien? Or is it more like Tolkien, or is the Bible and the poetry and Tolkien all sort of in the same ballpark?
Yeah, right.
And I think my sense is that there are good reasons why the Jewish and Christian traditions honor the Hebrew Bible, New Testament, as distinct and with a certain kind of sacred precedence. Then, by way of analogy, I want to treat the Hindu poetry that I read similarly, with the same respect, the similar expectation that it is transformative, the similar sense that this can make you holy if you read it carefully. Also mindful of the fact that there's a lot of literature in ancient South India, and these people are very clear, all right, this is sacred scripture, that's not. And they make their own distinctions, and I don't think it's my job to tell them, no, wait a minute, all of it is just literature, or nobody in South India thinks that text is sacred, but I do. That wouldn't help. So I think it's these kind of comparisons I think are difficult, but I think they work, I would say.
Good. Other thoughts, questions? Shneel.
Hello. I just wanted to first off thank you for coming to speak with us. This is really cool to talk to the same dude that wrote one of the reflections that we had to write in class. But my question to you is like, this is kind of a personal question, so feel free to say that, but say that you can't answer specifically. But I guess what I'm trying to ask is, in your study of Hinduism, what was like one like very specific instance that it like connected you in a deeper way to Catholicism? Because I guess I'm like I'm struggling to figure out how you can. I was one of the people that you read one of the reflections for, and I was the guy that said like I kind of find it. I would say it's difficult to like stick to your culture and your religion, and then also read other things without like withholding certain things that you hold to be true. So I guess like I'm trying to find like an example where you can say this is when I was able to find something new and truthful and divine, but also stay true to what I used to believe in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Let me give it a try. I think when I talk about, learning something new, it's not like a quantitative sense, like now I have 3 new things that I've learned from Hinduism that I add to the 12 things that I already know from Christianity, but new in the sense of deepening or transforming by this kind of learning. So I gave one example early about going to the Dakshin Kali temple, the Hindu, the goddess temple outside Kathmandu Valley. And I think given, you'd have to know something about Roman Catholics, but when we talk about the Mass or the Eucharist, there's a sense that this is somehow a reenactment of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And there's a way in which the meal at the altar is both the Passover meal, the death of Christ on the cross. And the Bible is full of images of blood and sacrifices and so on. And I think it begins to become alive when you see a tradition that has not abandoned that. And therefore, what do I do when I'm a priest at the altar? And I begin to be mindful that in the old days, long ago, that altar would have a drain on the side because I'd be offering, sacrificing animals and the blood would drain off and so on like that. Not that I start telling the poor people in my parish, next week we'll start sacrificing chickens during Mass, but rather to say that this is something really sacred, and we're not just here for a chat or to just read readings and say some obvious things and then go home, but rather there's something sacred and even dangerous going on here. The other example I also alluded to, Hindu goddesses and the Virgin Mary. So what I tell people is, writing about Hindu goddesses with whom I have great sympathy and interest doesn't mean that the creed of the Catholic Church or the Nicene Creed, I believe in God the Father, I believe in the goddess who is our mother. We don't add to it in that way and try to get people to add in other figures. But what I think it does, on the one hand, is say, why do we use masculine language regarding the divine? What is it we're losing if we don't use the feminine language too? Why is it that the creeds of the church and much of the Bible talk about father and only rarely sometimes, but talk about mother only rarely? That kind of thing. And then if you have the logic of the Catholic faith or the Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Russian, Ukrainian Orthodox, and so on, the role of the Virgin Mary, or even in Islam, Maryam in the Quran, that somehow what to make, that this is not just a superstition, oh, Mary, the mother of Jesus, is actually the mother of God, but realize the power of the supreme feminine, the feminine who is a mother figure. You begin to see deeper into that. So those are little examples. I could keep going, I suppose. But what did I learn from Hinduism that I didn't learn from Christianity? Another example, because I want to make sure we get to other questions, would be karma and rebirth. Christians believe in one birth. Did I learn additionally that if you prefer, you could come back into the world again? So you can believe in rebirth and you'll be reborn. That's a complicated issue, but I think what it does for me is raise, why do we have such utter confidence as Christians that we live once and then go to God, when we have very little evidence for that compared with Hindus or Buddhists who might say, over many lifetimes, you find your way to the divine? And that some of these things we believe because we believe them, but not because there's abundant, evidence. And therefore, thinking about karma and rebirth makes me think about, why do I believe in one birth only? And that's new in a certain way, but it's not new additively or quantitatively. Thank you.
Brian.
Hello. I also just wanted to thank you for talking to us today. My question was kind of in particular to the Catholic world. And having grown up Catholic, I have just kind of a background in that. And it seems to me currently there's been a segment of the Catholic faith of parishioners and both clergy who have been trying to move away from Vatican II in a certain sense, or kind of want to get rid of it.
Mm-hmm.
And as we talked about, Vatican II and the Nostra Aetate and all that kind of stuff was kind of this, again, to my knowledge, kind of this opening up in my mind of the Catholic faith to understanding and acceptance of, like you said, the truth that we can find in other religions and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, I feel like there's something valuable in that. And kind of what I'm trying to get at is, why do you think there are those clergy and parishioners who want to get rid of Vatican II or want to move away from that or don't want to accept that?
Yes, that's a great question. We could talk about it some other time too also, but I think I would take it on several levels. One would be, there are some people, I think, who erroneously, though they're not old enough, romanticize what the church was like in 1950 or 1960 and say, if only we could go back to the good old days of pre-Vatican II, we'd all be happy and the churches would be full and so on. I mean, I'm old enough to remember how boring Mass could be in the 1950s. So I don't think it was necessarily a great time. So somewhere like that, nostalgia. Other people say, okay, the council was okay, but that it's been misinterpreted. It's been taken prisoner by liberals, and things that the bishops that in 1963 or 65 meant have been distorted by people in North America or Western Europe and so on like that. I think that can be an honest debate. I think often it's said as if it was gospel truth, like, the council was fine, but then everyone's gotten it wrong since then, including Paul VI and John Paul II and Benedict and Francis. They all got it wrong. I think there are those kind of fictions that come up that don't very much help. But I think for some people, I think I would admit that I'm sort of, in one way, treading on, it's a tricky thing to do what I do and to argue about interreligious learning and facing up to the truth of other traditions. And I think it's almost, if not a full-time job, it's something like a full-time job where you better know what you're talking about, and you better do your homework, and you better study hard. And that for people who have vague ideas about other religions and vague senses of idolatry and black magic and evil goddesses and so on like that, they haven't done their homework. They don't know what they're talking about. They say yoga's from the devil and so on like that. And they're all kind of all over the place, not very intellectually robust or strong. And if that's the way they feel, then they would be better to retreat to a simpler Catholic faith. I would never challenge people at the door of the church and say, you should learn about Krishna, you should learn about Hindus. No, I try to take people where they are and let them believe as they believe. But I think Vatican II, when John the 23rd said, let's open the windows of the church and let in some fresh air, that can be challenging because it blows all the dust off the desk and it messes up the papers that have been piled up for centuries. I think some people are afraid where this would lead in terms of shattering what they or their parents or grandparents believed about the church. But I think, even if one is not, I'm sort of a progressive. I don't think I'm a radical liberal, but if I tell people, if you would just read the teachings of Pope John Paul II about interreligious dialogue, if you accept that, then you accept Vatican II. There's no way to put a wedge between St. John Paul II and Vatican II. And if you reject the council, you end up rejecting John Paul II too. So I think I better stop there, but if that helps just to get started, but you could email me, we could continue if you wanted to talk more about it.
It does, I appreciate it, thank you.
Okay, sure.
So we're officially out of time, but I don't want to stop. So let's kind of change the expectation that if you need to run, and since we did schedule it at 3, feel free to go ahead and log out. But I think we should continue for at least another 10, 15 minutes and field a few more questions because things are still pretty lively. So Jacqueline, you want to jump in?
Hi, I also come from a Christian background, but I was raised like in the Protestant tradition. And something like I had been struggling with was that like as a child, I was encouraged to kind of foster my own like intellectual exploration of my personal faith. But there were always like certain boundaries, like certain exclusivist claims. But like as a whole, I'd say my faith was kind of guided rather than decreed. But it feels like somewhat contradictory that there were like certain things that were off the table. And I was wondering if you had any advice on like how to reconcile like those things.
I mean, I think this too is a wonderful question. It gets, it doesn't have to just do with world religions. It has to do with just every aspect of Christian life. I mean, it goes, I mean this mostly seriously. It goes back to the Garden of Eden, where God says you can eat of all the trees of the garden, but not that one. And immediately Adam and Eve go to that one. And the serpent says, here, eat of the fruit of this tree. There's a certain sense in which there are boundaries and limits. Like you can do this, you can do this, you can do this, but you can't do that. You can raise certain questions, but you can't raise other questions. And I think maybe that's the nature of traditions that have some sense. If you're going to be in this tradition, there are certain things you can't say. So I mentioned before the creed, like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, that many churches have adapted for 1800, 1700 years. And there are ways in which I think most Christians, not all, but most Christians would say, if you cannot say that Jesus was God and human at the same time, then you're not one of us. If you can't make Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you're not one of us. And I think to some extent that makes sense, these kind of boundaries that come up. And I would say that there can be interreligious claims like that too. So if you say, Jesus is the savior for Christians and Krishna is the savior for Hindus and the Buddha is the savior for Buddhists, I think you're treading on ground that many Christians would not accept. And it sounds so deflating and relativistic. But you got to apply this to morality too. Like you can do this, but you can't do that. Officially the Catholic Church frowns on birth control and abortion. And then more liberal Catholics say, okay, birth control is okay, but abortion is not. And then, as you know, people start then debating abortion about, okay, it's a terrible thing after 15 weeks, but before 15 weeks, it's okay. Or when there are conditions like the life of the mother in danger, it's okay, but otherwise it's not. People are always, kind of sensibly or legalistically trying to draw limits. And I think that's okay. Or even people, I'm really treading on ground, touchy ground, with weapons. It's okay to have a pistol, but to have an assault rifle and go into a stadium is not okay. Likewise, religiously, respecting your neighbor religiously is good. Saying good things about Islam, good things about Hinduism is okay. Going into a Hindu temple and prostrating yourself and worshiping a Hindu deity would be shaky for most Christians. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking, or other issues?
Like kind of that, but also like with the ideas that you can only like grow closer to God, you can only be saved like sola fide and sola scriptura, where like other like religions that I've like encountered was that you could grow like personally closer to God through practices like yoga. So just kind of trying to see how those things could fit together, or if they like have to contradict.
Yeah. And I think, there's a certain sense in which, sola scriptura, so, by the word of God alone, or in the Catholic sense, by the word of God as understood in the church, has a real power to it. But it's a very different thing to say, well, because one believes in the word of God, therefore yoga is wrong. because actually the Bible says nothing about yoga. We know that. It says nothing about breathing exercises. There's nothing about lotus positions. It says nothing about almost anything we connect with yoga. And you say, well, yoga, a stand-in for yoga is worship of demons, or the awful things they do in the high places in the prophets. If one is, if you have a sharp intellectual dimension to your mind, and say people are condemning something based on faith alone, scripture alone, because somehow they think that means no yoga, no, I don't know, I mean, no going to temples. If you're a Christian, you can't say that eating beef is wrong. And so, like, there are all kinds of things that are not in the Bible that people say are obviously extensions of the Bible that seem not to be. And I would say, like as I do with my students here, and I'm sure your professors do with you, give you a hard time when you say something, not you personally, Jacqueline, but give somebody a hard time and say, what are you talking about? I mean, where is the boundaries? And I think that's good. And it's always fair in debates to be able to say, or you say this, but isn't this other case, which is actually outrageous, like your case? So if I tell you, well, as a Christian, you can do yoga, isn't there some like awful practice that then somebody say, well, that means you can do an awful practice too? No, because yoga is not the same as that abomination you're thinking of. Or so it's you're raising really basic questions. But I think my disposition as a Catholic and as a Jesuit, because Jesuits are Catholic intellectuals, is when in doubt, don't be afraid of the next question, or don't be afraid of putting your foot over the boundary, I would say. But thank you. That's probably as much as I can say at the moment.
All right, Pranav, take us home.
All right, Professor Clooney, that was great. And if I may, let me take you back to the Harvard poetry.
Yes.
That was terrific. I must confess I haven't read a lot of Harvard poetry. So that's another great thing about Professor Clooney. He makes Hindus like me take my own stuff more seriously. So there's this thing that we spoke about in our class, the idea of Shraddha as distinct from a faith that is attached to a certain kind of, set of propositions, whether they're propositions about ultimate reality, propositions about history, or these so-called trans-historical propositions, things like incarnation of God on earth and things like that. And it seems like to me, when I read the Harvard poetry, it's just sort of a manifestation of the Shraddha, where Shraddha is something far broader than just like a belief in a particular set of propositions. It's as you put it, it's a kind of lived truth. In our class, we spoke about Shraddha as lived certainty in something more nebulous, something like the efficacy of your own tradition, that somehow it's connected up with the PHILOS, the goal. And it seemed like that was very that seemed to be coming through in the Harvard poetry. So my question is, is that how you're reading it? And secondly, how relevant is Shraddha to you as a Roman Catholic? There was this question about what do we have to believe? Do we really have to sign up to all these things and so on? Is like having Shraddha or having faith in this sort of broad sense, is that a substitute, or is that a more central part of living the spiritual life, and in particular living the Roman Catholic spiritual life? So a couple of questions there.
Yeah, thank you. I would say first of all that I like, again, the poetry. First of all, as you know, Pranav, I mean, so much of Indian writing is in the form of poetry anyway. And texts that we take in the West to be philosophical texts are in verse form. So it had to do with memorization and passing them down and so on like that. But I think I like the poetry because it does get you back to this level of the intuitive, the lived experience, the respect for how the words come from the poet and are trying to communicate and so on like that. And I think, although it can be done, like the philosophy of the Alvars, there's actually a book with that, more than one book with that title. So what are the philosophical claims that are made by poets? And coming out, here's the Alvars, the South Indian saints, their doctrine of creation, their doctrine of the nature of God, their nature, doctrine of ethics. That can be done, and it's not impossible, because we don't want to say that these poets are, not thoughtful or have no kind of intellectual dispositions. But to talk about the poetry is valuable insofar as it's making truth claims, I think is wrongheaded, and that the poetry, the claims of the appeals of the poetry have much more to do with a different level of truth and a different kind of understanding. And this is where, I think Christians have found for centuries, you can wrongheadedly read the first chapters of Genesis about creation and say, well, these claims are manifestly untrue. There is no, scientific truth to this. Therefore, we have nothing to learn from the first chapters of Genesis. But if you read them with a literary eye, then suddenly the truth is opened up for them. And so then on the idea of the Shraddha, I mean, I think as I understand that, it often has to do with like one's relationship to a teacher or a guru. And I think this has to do with very primal claims about, why people went to the Buddha and learned from the Buddha, or why people followed the Prophet Muhammad. And the Gospels are full of this, about people, Jesus is not going around making truth claims. And, the philosophy of Jesus is kind of a secondary thing if it exists at all. But his claims, his inviting claims, like leave what you have and follow me, come with me, are much more powerful. And people, get up and leave everything behind and they follow him. That kind of faith in Jesus is, I think, maybe more powerful than a faith that would be, I agree with the following propositions, even though propositions are not necessarily hostile to Shraddha. I think that's the case. And therefore, with the Hinduism, many of these poets, and if I gave you, many more of the verses about, trust in the Lord, come to him, surrender at his feet. There's a certain kind of truth in practice that is then recognizable to people who believe that surrender to God in Islam. Islam means surrender is possible, or come to Jesus, throw yourself down at the feet of Jesus, that these things that then work on a different level. But that kind of existential lived relationship is a more powerful and comprehensive truth. And the analytic truth claims, I think, are not non-existent or not unimportant, but I think they're less important because we don't live by truth claims alone.